So friends, I was saying that, imagine a situation in which you pose a situation where we can ask few questions. What if Lincoln had not had an anti-slavery stance right in the beginning? To grasp the nature of causality or to reject it altogether, effect is primary in search of causes, in search for cause. So, in counterfactual perspective, we can ask many questions. Had Lincoln missed it? He was also a human being, so he might have been, very tired on that day, and he could have asked his wife to relax. We will go next day. So he could have escaped. But these are possibilities. What could have had happened. But what had happened, historian is concerned with that. That is also a method because as I was telling you in the previous lecture, after Robert Fogel and Peter Temin and others have written on the utility of counterfactual history writing, the counterfactual situation is also a must situation for historians who are looking for real cause. So, what we find is that it's not a simple exercise. We have a very complex situation. So, complexity of causation can be seen in the reversal of, say, Friedrich Nietzsche, A Critique of Truth, 1844-1900, a German philosopher, classical scholar, a critique of culture. He argued that to understand the nature of causality or to reject it altogether, the effect is primary in search for causes. So, he is giving primacy to effect, not to the cause. In larger sense, the future plays a critical role in determining the past because the future role which you will discern from this event will determine our apprehension of the present. So, their argument is that future is the place where we locate our goal, making desires, and the past is the material for their realization. In other words, this orientation suggests this is a very peculiar orientation. This orientation suggests why history is written like fiction, because historical narrative has the capacity or power to complicate cause and effect by different approaches to the problem. So, in other words, we can say that causes do not have to be offered sequentially. They are actually a problem in need of a solution. Behind the effect, a prior fact would exist which would explain the situation. In other words, in history, causes are often given as effects in search of an interpretational explanation, in search for a plausible explanation. So, in the physical or natural sciences, we use deductive inference, and there the deductive inference has got an edge over humanities. In sciences, this I had dealt with in my first lecture also, second lecture. In sciences, causation is a matter of observations of something which is regularly occurring. So, of regular occurrences hypothesis framing, and then you put to test what you have already known, So, then you put to empirical testing, that is experimentation, with the express objective of or aim of generating covering laws. The basic principle in science is that you discover certain laws which would be applicable in all circumstances, in all countries, for all human beings, because they are very closer to natural laws. But can we have covering laws? Of course, after Frankfurt schools development and other schools developed, they were all looking for covering laws. Covering laws are possible in science, but as I said, even there, every day you are finding that old notions of sciences are being increasingly challenged with the new experimentations and the new broadening of the horizon of knowledge. Therefore, it also has a limitation. But whatever, at least the sciences have this kind of, what I said earlier, repeat performance. where you can repeat the same thing in any amount of lab you test them. So, in science, the truth emerges through the correspondence theory of knowledge, which may, and in humanities, we are, in contrast, we are unable to see behind the appearance of historical and usually textualized phenomenon. They are never identical. Behan McCulloch, the historian, is a very prolific historian. He has written a book called Justifying Historical Descriptions. I'm, referring to this book because he is dealing with the subject which we are dealing today, which is a subject of today's discussion. His argument is that a cause is an event which produces a conjunction of something that has a tendency to produce an effect of the kind which occurred in certain circumstances and in the presence of some triggering circumstance, possibilities plus a combination of necessary and sufficient causes, meaning thereby that there should be a situation where that event was bound to take place, was about to take, not bound, about to take place. So, the possibility should be there, plus there should be a combination of necessary and sufficient cause. If necessity is not there and the sufficient causes are not there, then this event will not take place. I mean to say that. So, it is the historians, presentists and teleological assumptions which he or she believes will influence people. Yesterday, I was talking about subjectivity. So, it is the erudition of the historian, his concerns, his maturity, all these things will influence the decision to look for causes. So, processes and events like agency, structure, intentionality, motivational psychology and various determinism like geography, gender, ideology, ethics, materiality, culture, and even in the case of India, there are so many identities. So, you will have to take all these into your consideration, and until unless you take all these things into your consideration, you can, in other words, I am suggesting that we will have to, the historian is expected to have a holistic approach. You should not leave or jump upon a conclusion just on the basis of one set of facts or one set of causes. That will be quite misleading. Therefore, the teleological assumptions which are held by the historians, that future conceived in the present determines the past, these kind of things, influence the form which causal questions are expressed, in which causal questions are expressed. So, the historians prior consideration of the historical field, the questions he or she frames before jumping upon the research about the causality that assume a particular direction or shape. I will elaborate upon this later. For example, the question raised is why this happened, why Lincoln was assassinated, why this happened, or whether if something else had happened, the same effect would be found. Was it possible? We can't equate the disaster which followed as Lincoln's assassination with any mishap which happened subsequently in any part of the world. Both can't be equated. So, the historian is not only predetermining meaning to a greater or lesser extent by the form in which historian casts the problem. That is important. In which perspective you are trying to look at certain facts, but she or he is also working teleologically within her or his own selection and arrangement of evidence, I mean hierarchy of evidence, hierarchy of events. Therefore, any attempt to have a causal analysis is a set of preformed ideas about what is most likely to be the meaning of one set of events occurring after another. So, who will decide the decision to assign significances, the meaning through a particular causal connection will be based on, invariably will be based on historians' preference for a particular outcome, rather than one formed objectively in the evidence. So, here I would pause and elaborate upon this. The positivist school, they had a different opinion. They say that they preclude, they exhort that you should not go beyond the facts. Now, this line of argument which I just now gave would be in contradiction to that. I said that for a particular outcome rather than for one formed objectively in the evidence should be the preference of a historian. At the end of such a vast exercise, much depends on the historian, his ability to grasp the thing, his ability to pick the threads of argument, his ability to look for facts and try to connect it with the events, and his ability to overall conceive the situation, and then he will have to raise certain questions to be addressed, like how did the world work in the past as does in the present? What are his or her or his ontological beliefs? What methodology does a historian intends to apply to give effect to them? Does a historian believe in agent intentionality or the materialistic theory of history, which is obviously given by Marx and others, economic determinism, or the postmodernist tool, that is power of complex social structures to flatten out historical changes? The postmodern school, they talk in terms of power. So, all these three possibilities are there. You can have agent intentionality, that the assassin was determined to assassinate. Materialistic theory of history, that you can find the reasons in anti-slavery stance of Lincoln, or power complex social structures. So, what mechanism the historian should think, or things change over time generally or in a specific time. So, the nature of causation can be fruitfully explored if a historian decides to use one of the theories of causality. There are many theories of causality. Eventually, it is the historian's own assessment, his own assumptions, his own objective or desires, which will shape the narrative form of explanation. What you are trying to build at, that will decide. So, how does construction of a narrative influences our causal explanations? That should be the first question. Secondly, the causation, when translated into a narrative, when transformed into a narrative, is far more complex process than a single notion of narrative defined as, I quote, this I would put in quote, as this happened, then that happened. So, you assume that had this not happened first, the second sequential thing would not have happened. So, narrative does not require the cause to be followed by the effect or consequence. If the historian is writing from politically liberal perspective, that is to say that who believe in agent intentionality, narrative would represent people's decision as choices. That people decided, so this was the choice, and events as particular responses, then effects. So, this would mean that narrative is explanatory for political liberal historians because they reject a deterministic causality, that nobody determines, it is not determined by economy of the period, that they consider to be associated with ideological positions of which they disapprove. The reverse could also be true. So, the complexity of causation should not be, cannot be simply diverged from the questions of narrative explanation narrative, you can't separate the two, because the narrative itself has an ambiguous status among historians. When we say that we don't agree with this line of argument, that is the problem of the narration, the narrative. So, it also has an ambiguous status among the historians, serious historians. For example, I will give you one example from this famous Scottish, social theorist and philosopher, William Gallie. His book is on pragmatism. If you read his book, you will find that in his book Pragmatism, he is dealing with pragmatism as an instrument, and he believed that narrative is the essence of history. Narrative is the essence of history because there is a strong epistemological connection between the evidence and the explanation through causality as translated into a narrative form. Other historians whom I consider, most modern, he is still around and writing. Some of the very good Pursuit of History is one of his classics. So, this gentleman was born in 1945. He is in sympathy with constructionist mainstream, who are of the opinion that narrative is relatively weak method for explaining the past if it is simply a causal description of this happened, then that happened syndrome. So, in other words, John Tosh is taking us closer to what, Carr was saying. But Alan Munslow, if you read his books, you will find his, articles also, you will find that he is telling us that the Carr, because he is putting so much emphasis on causation in history, role of causation in history. So, Tosh is saying, Alan Munslow is saying that Carr is sometimes relatively, more relativist. He says dangerously relativist, which is a very strong statement against Carr. We can't dispense with Carr's expositions. Carr, what Carr is saying, he is very serious in his arguments and he is very logical also. So, tomorrow we will, in our next class, we shall pick up the other causes which sometimes the historians ignore and sometimes they overemphasize, the role of accidents in history, and how after that, Fisher and others, I will also say few things about how the postmodernists are looking at the role of causation in history. So, with these few words, I thank you all. Thank you very much.